How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has thrown global energy markets into chaos. Disruptions to Europe's gas supplies threaten to leave millions in the cold. Control over resources has long been an underlying cause of war, and this latest crisis could dramatically alter the map of energy geopolitics. Will the turmoil give the world the extra push it needs to decarbonize? Or will some countries always be beholden to untrustworthy partners for the resources they need? Playing with fire, Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics of energy. Up next on Climate One.
Let's begin with the end of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin stood on the tank in that iconic moment and was elected first president of the Russian Federation. He appointed Vladimir Putin as prime minister, preparing him for leadership. The Berlin Wall was down, and Russia continued to use energy as a geopolitical tool. How did that play out from the fall of the wall until, say, 2020?
Well, it's been a journey, Greg, and it started out somewhat positively. After September 11, Vladimir Putin approached the United States and said that Russia could be the secure sea of energy for the West. He came to the United States. We saw American oil companies go and help Russia revive its industry, which had just crumbled from mismanagement and lack of capital. And it looked like we were all on track to have Russia sort of, quote unquote, be part of Europe. But then over time, things deteriorated. We saw Russia use energy as a geopolitical weapon first in 2006 against the Ukraine, then in 2009 in a way that affected heating in Germany for 2 weeks. And we've been sort of on this trajectory of concern for the level of Russian supply in Europe since then.
Right, and going into this winter, European energy demand was rising faster than supply coming out of the economic slump. Russian companies cut back methane gas to supplies to Europe around 25% as prices surged, not in their own financial interests, leaving profits on the table. How did Russia weaponize its energy exports in advance of the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, we had some momentum that looked less frightening. I mean, as we were leading up to the Glasgow summit, you saw OPEC Plus, which is sort of OPEC plus Russia and some other countries, actually say they were not going to put more oil on the market, even though markets were tightening. And a lot of us interpreted that as a belief that high energy prices, especially in Europe, would discourage global leaders from tackling climate change in a strong way. But luckily, when we got to Glasgow, the United States, the EU, China, even India to some extent, really, sort of stepped up to the plate and talked about raising ambition. And we kind of had not as much momentum as we needed in Glasgow, but certainly we did not see the high energy prices dissuade countries from action. And in fact, good diplomacy on the part of the United States and other countries led to some of the producers in the Middle East, like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, committing to net zero. So we looked like we were over that hump. And then we started hearing this saber rattling about Ukraine. And to remind your listeners, because at the time it first happened, it didn't raise the alarm bells that, of course, then later came to be. But last July, so July 2021, Vladimir Putin wrote a treatise. And in his treatise, he explained about his revisionist views of the history of the Russian people. And in that treatise, he mentioned that Ukraine was part of Russia, and he even blamed Poland for the start of World War II. So we were already kind of like lurching on a pathway of trying to understand what was going through the Kremlin's mind, even as early as last summer.
And sounds like, yeah, Russia was on a different path from other countries, oil suppliers who kind of came together in Glasgow, that very important climate summit. Germany was seduced by cheap Russian gas, and about a third of its crude oil and half of its coal comes from Russia. So as the strongest economy in Europe, how much leverage does that give Putin over Germany?
Well, it gave him a lot of leverage. The thesis over the years on Germany is, well, we're going to have this double-edged sword that means that Russia can't act extreme because they need the revenue from Germany, and Germany, we're showing our willingness to work cooperatively because we're willing to buy a lot of Russian energy and support the economy of Russia. And of course, that entire philosophy has now been entirely discredited in German politics. But the German government, sadly, committed a lot of own goals. They did a lot of things wrong. Not only this high dependence on Russia, which of course the United States has been bugging them about since Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump went and said, we'd like to help you finance an LNG receiving terminal, liquefied natural gas, so you can receive natural gas from the United States back when he was first president. They had some fanfare and then didn't do it. They have excellent resources of offshore wind, but there was political opposition to bringing a high transmission wire from northern Germany down to southern Germany to meet that demand. Germany has its own domestic natural gas resources. They decided that they would not drill their own natural gas. They would prefer to have the pollution be in other countries. And then you got the decision to close down nuclear, which one can understand, but you would wonder, does it make sense to close nuclear ahead of the winter instead of after the winter when you're only talking about a few months? And then finally, the worst mistake, I think, that could have been totally predictable, is that Germany allowed Gazprom, the Russian state natural gas exporter that does supply its supply, to buy its inventory storage, the physical storage tanks that there are in Germany. Some of them were owned by Gazprom. And in the lead up to the winter this year, guess what? Gazprom left those tanks empty.
So lots there to unpack. You talk about liquid natural gas exports to Europe. A lot of people in the US would like to say, hey, well, we can replace Russian gas with US gas. Happy to export that to Europe. Will that happen? Could the US supply enough methane gas to replace Russian gas in Europe and wean them off this Russian dependence?
So we increased those exports to Europe over this past, October, November, and into this winter. It's helped a lot. Things would be even worse, believe it or not. But to export the gas requires special facilities that take the gas and turn it cryogenically into a liquid. And so we have a limit on how much we can do that. So that raises a question, which is a really very challenging question. Do we add more facilities? Do companies invest because it costs billions of dollars? Or will that create sort of path-dependent infrastructure that will then become stranded as Europe moves more to renewables and away from natural gas over time? And that leaves us sort of in a bind between the immediate emergency and how do we plan out not what we do over the next couple of months, but what do we do in the 1, 2, and 3 year time frame, as opposed to the 10-year time frame where Germany has already announced it will shoot for 100% renewables.
Right, and there's be a lot of certainly environmental and local opposition to those big natural gas export terminals, that those things don't come on quickly. You said that we're entering an era of abundant methane gas because liquefied natural gas can be put on ships, yet there's a lot of research coming out on fugitive methane, which is a huge problem. Methane is 80 times more damaging to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide in the near term. The carbon math is that we need to reduce methane, not increase it. So where does that leave us?
It does leave us in a problem. Now, there are some bridges. State of California has been sort of proactive in looking at renewable natural gas. So I'm making the methane from biomaterials and waste. Problem with that, of course, is once I put it in a facility, it's methane, and I still have to be leakage proof. But I can add CCS to it, which makes it a negative emissions, which is something we need to go to for net zero. So you're seeing more conversation in the United States and Europe about going to this more renewable form of natural gas. And you do have more producers here in the United States, Pennsylvania, for example, making sure that their new wells are methane leakage free. And you're seeing more activity and proactive maintenance in the pipeline industry in the United States to reduce emissions. And then you see some states being very proactive, like Colorado, which has tight regulations that doesn't allow for the leakage of methane from production facilities.
Right, and CCS being the carbon capture and sequestration. So you mentioned that Germany's announced going to 100% renewable. What, looking at Europe broadly, what alternatives do they have? Back to nuclear, pump up renewables, accelerate the European Green Deal. How is this changing the energy politics and dynamics in Europe?
So Europe had a great plan as it was. We all said not fast enough, but as your listeners probably understand, we have this path dependency of our existing infrastructure. So it's hard to go from today's infrastructure to the new infrastructure, in a year. It takes some time to do the building and retiring. But different countries in Europe have different plans. Italy is moving forward to be a hydrogen hub, a green hydrogen hub, taking solar energy also from Southern Europe, but possibly even from North Africa, and becoming a trading area for hydrogen, which is made from renewables, can be sort of a storage. So in other words, it's hard to store the sun or the wind. It's windy usually at night, it's sunny during the day, but hydrogen is sort of a bridge fuel where we can produce hydrogen from the renewables when they're available and then use the hydrogen later. So Italy is sort of pioneering that, but in Northwest Europe, tremendous amount of offshore wind that's being produced and new projects being fast forwarded. And some of those projects in Denmark and other places, again, trying to connect to hydrogen.
BP and Shell pulled out of joint ventures with Russian giants Gazprom and Rosneft. Shell said it would continue buying Russian oil and contribute the profits to humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. That met a firestorm of backlash. CEO Ben Van Beurden then apologized for that move and now says the company will not buy Russian oil. How are these branded oil companies being affected by this crisis? On the one hand, their brands might be taking a hit, and yet they were probably making pretty good profits with a surge in prices.
I think that gasoline is such a fungible retail product that it's not really about the brand. BP walked away from billions of dollars in assets, for which they're not likely to ever get compensation. I really do think that their chairman, who has already indicated he's trying to go on the path of net zero, right, was moved by its position in Europe. And I think for the American companies, they are going to come around to the fact that this war is not a limited regional war. This war is about democracy in Europe. It's going to be important for all corporations to support the efforts of Europe and the United States going forward. And I think the oil companies are understanding that, and they've acted surprisingly fast for them when it comes to removing themselves from Russia. And ExxonMobil's decision to leave Russia is already leading to oil wells in the Russian Far East to being shut down.
And what does that mean? Does that mean that they can't get out of the ground? Can the Russian oil be sold to other buyers in Asia and Africa? This is a very liquid global market. If the U.S. companies and European companies are not there producing, how does that affect Russia? Does that mean they can just sell it somewhere else, get it out themselves?
Well, there's some element of that. I mean, we're seeing barrels get reshifted. India bought a bunch of cargoes a few weeks ago in a tender. But there's some limits in the sense that, every oil in the world has its own fingerprint. And the Russian oil has some impurities that not every refinery can manage. So China is a really, really big buyer. And the question is going to be, will China step up to the plate and take more Russian oil or not? And I think it's not a given, because China themselves like to have a very diversified supply. They don't want to have to worry about supply security, just like we here in the United States and Europe. So I think it's really unclear how it's going to play out. Theoretically, the oil market's, very fungible. And, I tell people it's like a swimming pool. You can take a barrel out of the deep end and you pour it in the shallow end, and the water level in the whole pool stays the same. But we're already seeing this sort of cancel culture that applies to Russian non-contracted oil. So a lot of the oil that Russia sells, they would just put a cargo out and people would bid to buy it. And what we're seeing is we're already down 1.6 million barrels a day of lost Russian production because those cargoes can't be sold. And I think that's volume is probably going to go up over time. So as each company or country makes its own decisions, it could be a bigger and bigger disruption. And then it becomes, what do you do? Are we going to release more strategic stocks? Would we give incentives to US companies to drill more? The Biden administration has been flying around the world with its diplomats trying to get different countries to provide more oil, and that's not going well. There's the controversial question about whether or not we quickly finalize the Iran nuclear deal and put it back in place so that we can get that extra, million barrels a day from Iran. So, it's a very challenging time for the White House to balance its long-term policies with the sort of exigencies of war.
New York Times reporter Lisa Friedman was in CERAWeek in Houston recently, the annual gathering of energy executives. And she said about US oil companies, quote, "The vibe is, you thought you were done with us, but as recent events have shown, we're still quite important," end quote. The title of the piece was "Suddenly Oil Companies Are Upbeat Again." So how does this play into the oil companies in the United States? On the one hand, the Biden administration is trying to decarbonize, move away from oil production. And yet now they're in this situation where the energy and national security and political agendas have merged in the US and Europe. And you said maybe we need them to produce more in the US?
Well, we do, but there's a flip side to that. And the flip side is many of us understood the climate emergency. But for those who were not on board with the speed and pace of change we needed from the climate emergency, many of those citizens are now understanding that this high dependence on Russian oil or oil from other countries that might be inimical to Western democracy, that this is a problem. And of course, the big solution to that problem is to move off of fossil fuels and to other sources of energy that are domestically produced, like solar and wind. So we know where we want to go. It's just a question of the speed at which we can do it. And like I said, the president has to consider the social justice issues not only from the climate perspective, but from today's sort of COVID experience, where we now understand what it means to be, quote unquote, an essential worker. We understand the importance of supply chains to our economic well-being, but also our physical well-being. And that just takes a certain amount of oil-based fuel. That's just the reality of how we live right now. And, we have to make this distinction, which is very uncomfortable, between what our best trajectory is, which is to switch as much to domestic clean energy as fast as possible and get electric cars on the road as fast as possible, and the fact that we have 350 million liquid fuel fossil-based cars on the road today.
There is a notion that this transition to renewable energy will get away from the power of petrostates and avert wars for oil and reduce the power, reshift the power. Yet there's also, you referenced a little bit earlier, there is a supply chain for renewables. There's a lot of lithium in Ukraine. There are certain metals that are needed, cobalt and others that are needed for electrification to move away from liquid transportation fuels, move from oil to electricity. So how is that supply chain? And will it be as harmonious as some of the people claim it to be? Could we trade one vulnerability for another?
Well, let me just say the following thing. Oil is what I call a flow resource. The second you use it, you need more. So if I buy an electric car and it has a lithium battery, I don't need more lithium until I'm not using that car anymore, which in the United States could be 10 years, could be 14 years. So the trajectory for the leverage is different. I mean, for gearing up, of course, we need a lot of material, but once I have it in place, once I put in battery storage in Los Angeles, it's not like I have to, I bet those batteries will be in place for several years until I need to upgrade them and replace them. Once you put gasoline in your tank, you can't recycle that gasoline. So from my perspective, it's a totally different issue. And then also we have, chemists and others at work in companies and in our national labs, Tesla, coming up with a cobalt-less battery or coming up with a new material that's not lithium for batteries. So, we're going to get there. And if some producer of a particular metal thinks they're going to, gain political or geopolitical leverage over a supply chain, or they're going to cause a war over this metal, I think that's not going to stand over. It'll slow us down a little bit on the transition, but there are going to be other technological solutions and other kinds of metals that can be substituted out. So I don't think it's a long-term problem. I think that in the end, renewable energy will be easier to promote and move us away from geopolitical conflict.
And there's quite a debate often about whether high gas prices are good or bad for that transition, right? High gas prices means that, the electric cars are a lot more economical. As Bill McKibben tweeted recently, the sun appears to be providing energy at the same price as last week. So EVs are now more price competitive compared to that $7 gas. On the other hand, when gas prices are high, voters are cranky, midterms are coming, and politicians are very wary and want to get that price down, and makes them more reluctant to make changes in how we run our economy. So how does the high gas play out?
So listen, I think we're in a totally different situation. What you're describing, Greg, has been sort of the debate over the last 20 years. But I think the way we need to think about this is totally different. We're in a war. We can feel like that war is far away and doesn't involve us. But because we're participating through financial sanctions in supporting our allies in Europe, that means that we are involved in the transaction of trying to stop the further military activities of Russia. And that involvement means we need to reduce how much oil is used in the world. And we need to come up with replacement supplies for the oil we cannot reduce in the short term. And those things are not inconsistent. We should move forward and accelerate anything we can do to get electric cars on the road. If that means the Congress needs to pass additional legislation beyond the infrastructure bill, they should be doing that. State of California, other states could take state action.
Certainly during World War II, people rallied around the rationing of gas. People bonded, felt patriotic, that common sense of purpose. And I think that you're right, we're horrified by what we're seeing, these bombings in Ukraine. Not sure it's felt yet to that level.
It hasn't sunk into people that you can make a donation to the Red Cross, but you could also get out of your car, and that would also contribute to helping Ukrainians and the whole process. I mean, why are you waiting for BP to take action for you when you can take action yourself by thinking about your own movements and your own use of oil, when indeed you should be doing that anyway because of climate change? I mean, when you think about the climate emergency and you think about wanting to support democracy in Europe, the action is the same. You need to use less fuel. You need to not use oil when you can. You need to think about ways to reduce your carbon footprint, which are also ways that are going to reduce the amount of money going to Russia. All of those things are the same. And we're waiting for someone to do it outside. And we can do it ourselves. Vladimir Putin is counting on the fact that people will refuse to get out of their cars and people will refuse to put their thermostat down 1 degree. He is counting on that for the money to fund his war machine. And if we can't take that on board, then he's going to be right. And that's going to be a tragedy. And it's a tragedy for the climate.
We've been discussing the geopolitics of energy with Amy Myers Jaffe. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Talking about climate can be hard and depressing, and it can also be exciting. You can hear more on our podcast on Apple or wherever you get your pods. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.